Olá, boa tarde a todos e todas. Sejam muito bem-vindos a essa sessão do 4º Congresso Internacional de Jornalismo de Educação, que vai tratar dos desafios do jornalismo independente de educação nos Estados Unidos e no Brasil. Eu sou a Tatiana Klix, sou jornalista, sou diretora da Geduca e também do Porvir, um portal independente sobre inovações em educação no Brasil. E eu tenho a honra de dividir essa mesa com uma pessoa muito especial, que é a Sarah Garland. Ela é diretora-executiva do The Hechinger Report, um site que cobre educação há mais de 20 anos nos Estados Unidos. Essa conversa está sendo gravada para que a gente possa fazer a transmissão durante o congresso com o áudio original e legendas. Good afternoon, Sarah. Thank you for being here with us. It's a pleasure to talk to you in this Congress about independent education journalists. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Great. Can you introduce yourself and also the Hechinger Report to our audience, please?
Yes. So I'm the executive editor at the Hechinger Report. I've been there for 10 years. We started out as a small nonprofit news outlet covering education, and we're now national. We have about 23 staff members writing about education all around the United States and occasionally internationally as well.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit more about the whole project? How did you start and how did you get from the beginning until now? How do you sustain this project and everything?
Yes, absolutely. So previously, before I came to Hechinger, we were actually a training institute. So we were a group based at a university here in New York City, and we would hold trainings for education journalists from around the country. The focus was, getting education journalists informed about research, informed about sort of a very complicated beat here and everywhere. And we saw as the recession hit in 2008, already journalism was in decline. The industry here got hit very badly. There was a lot of layoffs, newspapers closing, and there were fewer journalists, frankly, to train at those seminars that we held. And so our leadership at the time made a shift, talked to some funders here about taking on a new model, which was up and coming here in the US, similar to our public radio system where we have member-funded and philanthropy-funded public radio around the country. The idea was to use that to create digital-first news outlets. ProPublica had gone before us. The Texas Tribune is also a big outlet that's a nonprofit. But this was a fairly new idea in terms of the digital-only, digital-first news ecosystem. So we shifted gears. And in 2010, we launched a publication called the Hechinger Report. So I was hired as the first staff writer. There was just me, and there was about 3 or 4 other staffers, operations and editors. We had one intern who stayed on, and eventually she is now our data and investigations editor, leading award-winning investigations every year for us. So in those early days, our big focus was using our very small platform. We had a website that was basically a place where we put all of our stories, but our big focus was in placing those stories in bigger news outlets. So we worked with mostly newspapers like the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Dallas Morning News, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And our goal was to both do really in-depth journalism that fewer people were able to do, and also help those struggling newspapers do more with less because the industry was so crunched. So over the years, this model has taken off. Nonprofit media is growing in exponentially. Despite everything that's happening to the news industry, you've seen a huge growth in nonprofit news outlets. There's an industry group that we're a part of for nonprofit news that has increased, I think, 3 times the number of members in the last few years. Just incredible growth, because you've had this messaging from places like us that focus on one topic, education or criminal justice or others, and local media talking to often a big philanthropy around why journalism is so important to fund, especially as the for-profit model is in such distress. And you've also had members stepping up, especially for the local media and the local outlets, where they've really pushed the members, small donations or, of larger donations from wealthy members of the community. So it's been a promising model. It has not been easy to sustain. It's very, we, have grown since 2010 from an organization of about 5 or 6 people to more than 20. I think we have about 23 on staff right now, and more than half of those are reporters and editors. We have sort of a website engagement, social media staff, and then we have an operations staff and a development director. So it's been huge growth for us. We're still very, very small, but we've also had to really rethink our goals and our mission. So about 5 years ago, we redesigned our website and realized that for our future and our sustainability and, to make our place in the world, we were really going to have to set ourselves apart from the typical education coverage that you might see in the New York Times or on NPR or in your local paper, or places like Chalkbeat, which is very similar to us, akin to us, because they're nonprofit media, but they are hyper local and they are focused in particular cities, covering the day-to-day education news in those places. Here in New York City, we have a Chalkbeat bureau, for example, and they're covering, are the New York City schools going to be open next week? The ones that are closed because of the pandemic, how long will they be closed? And we really had to figure out a way to set ourselves apart from a lot of the education journalism that is still out there. And we have seen, which is really gratifying, I think, a growth in actual coverage of education in some places. Like the Atlantic, for example, created an education desk after we had formed. And we've seen the New York Times sort of build out their education coverage or their family and parenting coverage. So it's really important for us to think about how do we fit in and continue our mission of doing really in-depth, hard-hitting journalism, and continue to support the news outlets that we were formed to support, but also stand apart and do something different that other people aren't doing. So that's been our challenge. And one of the things we did was think about what is the big problem that we need to look at as journalists? What is sort of the underlying tension in every education story, at least that we care about on a national level? And for us, that big issue in US education is inequality, as I'm sure it is equally in Brazil and in other countries like ours and India. I think, inequality is sort of the foundational problem. Also, the mission of public education in the US. So there's this idea that education should be an equalizing force, but at the same time, it absolutely is not, in all kinds of ways, from early education until higher education. So that became sort of our basic foundational mission, is to cover the issue of inequality and all the different ways that it manifests in US education. So that was one thing that set us apart, was just that laser focus on that issue, although it still gave us obviously a broad range of things that we can write about. And then in addition to that, it has always been important to us, and we really wanted to lay out how we are set apart, because we don't only cover problems at the Hechinger Report. We're very interested and invested in solutions-focused journalism, which has become quite a buzzword here in the journalism industry. And so we also made that a piece of our mission, which is not only reporting on problems, but also looking at solutions, and we call it innovation. But the idea is looking at what are people doing to fix the problems that we are covering in our other reporting, and really looking at those with a skeptical, journalistic, evidence-based reporting style, where we're not doing puff pieces about this great new program, but we're really asking hard questions about a solution that someone has proposed. And can you replicate it? What is the evidence? Is it strong enough to suggest it really will work long term? Is it financially feasible if you do try to scale it? So those kinds of questions. And that's really become a hallmark of what we do as well. And I think it sets us apart. And so now here we are today, and we are still, we've come through this latest really difficult time financially for our country and for the world fairly unscathed. We had to lay off someone this summer, but at the same time, we have been working on shoring up our finances, and I do think our focus and our mission around these two important pieces has helped us explain why we're so important, and has helped us do the kind of impactful journalism that really makes a difference and convinces funders that it's important to fund outlets like ours, even though we don't have an advocacy position, even though we might write stories that they don't like. I think our journalism at this point, it speaks for itself for a lot of funders who really want to sort of create a conversation around the issues they care about.
Very, very good. Very interesting to hear you. I have a lot of questions, but I will start from where you stopped about your funders and about this model that you have, because that's a very huge challenge for independent journalists in Brazil, the funding. I can see that here the companies and foundations, they are not so open to support journalists like I see in the States. But as you told us now, you also have to work on this environment. It was not like that when you started, probably.
Exactly.
So we wanted to learn a little with you. How can we as journalists and also from independent outlets work to make this environment bigger, to convince foundations and companies and people to fund journalists? Do you think that's something we could also help to improve? It's our role to do that too, or how can we do that?
Yes, and so because we are a small outlet, I'm on the editorial side. I mean, just one of the things that nonprofit journalism has done has in some ways blurred those lines between, there used to be sort of the sales side of things and the business side of the newspaper, in a traditional newsroom, there's the business people and then there's the journalists. And in this world, that really, those lines have blurred a little bit. Not in the way that the journalism is done, but at least in forcing journalists to think about where's the money coming from and how do we make the argument that people should give us money for what we do. And I think that's been as challenging as it is. And I think we do, and I can talk about sort of the ethical thickets that we get into in dealing with that. It has forced our journalism, I think, to be more innovative. But I'll go straight. So to your question of how do we make that argument? So in the early days, we had, at least at Hechinger, and I think this was the case at other nonprofit news outlets, conversations with some of the bigger funders. In some cases, for ProPublica, for example, they had what we call an angel funder who gave them a ton of money, who really cared about journalism and wanted, saw what was happening to the industry and really wanted to start something that would make a difference. those kind of people, we've never found our angel funder. It's sort of a dream pie in the sky. And so I think for a lot of us, the work is around existing philanthropy often for a national outlet. It's different. There are different scales. So for a national outlet, I do think it's very different than a local outlet, at least in terms of who you're going after. But I think the conversation and the argument is the same, which is, in our space, we cover education. So there are a few grants that we have gotten from people, philanthropy or funders who care about journalism, maybe 2 or 3, very few. Instead, we've had to go after the money around the issues that we cover. So we mostly focus on convincing people who are funding other things in education that a piece of what they're doing, if it's going to make a difference, if you are the Kellogg Foundation here and you care about vulnerable children in Mississippi and New Orleans and the early childcare that's provided to them and the inequities in the school system, then you need to be funding journalists who are going to be making the public aware of those issues and holding policymakers accountable for not addressing those issues or for raising funding around the things that you care about. Or if you are the Gates Foundation, they are very savvy to this, but some of these others that care about, for example, Common Core was a big movement in our country to change the standards. And so for a while, we had a couple funders who really, really cared about Common Core. They wanted Common Core to take over the standards of the US. There was a big movement, several funders who really put a lot of money toward promoting that curricula. We also convinced them to give us money to write about how it was going. And our argument was, you are promoting these standards, but you need the public to understand what they mean, what the goals are, but also what the impact, and is it working? And so we used that money to write. We did it was a very important story at the time. In retrospect, it seems, very small now, but at the time it was a huge deal, and it still is a huge deal in the lives of a lot of parents who are dealing with Common Core in our daily lives as we try to teach our kids at home. And the stories we did were not very positive all the time. In fact, one of the founders of Common Core, one of the guys who wrote the Common Core math standards won't speak to us anymore. So because we did very critical, skeptical, good journalism around Common Core, but to those funders, it was important. And I would often make the argument is that you want the public to know what's going on and to understand this. As a foundation, it's going to be, good for you to be raising awareness around the topic that you care so much about. You want other people to know about it. And as a funder, you also want to know if what you're funding is working. And journalism is one way to do some of the evaluation process that is often baked into what funders do. But journalism writ large can really tell you, I put all this money toward Common Core. Did it work? Was it a good idea? And I think that's a question that for a lot of funders is really important. Like, is my money being well spent? And that's what journalism does, is ask the question all the time, is money being well spent? So we try to make that argument that, like, by funding journalists, you are funding a plank of, something that's essential for whatever it is that you care about. We're going to get it out there into the public sphere and people are going to be talking about it. And then we're going to be, the ones who let you know, is your investment worthwhile? And that will help you as you decide how to spend your money. So that's one of the other arguments I make. I will say we have the people, one of the big funders who gave us, this is one of my terrible and favorite stories about funders, is they cared a lot about Common Core. They gave us a lot of money to fund Common Core. And then they decided to stop funding education entirely. The board had decided what they really cared about was irritable bowel syndrome. So they took all their money away from education, and you know, it was a huge chunk of money for us. So we've had to be very nimble around thinking about each grant as something that could go away tomorrow, because these are the whims of wealthy people who can change their minds, or you know, foundations are constantly doing strategic refreshes where they change everything. So it's been very it's sustainability is just an ongoing traumatic process, I think, in the nonprofit journalism world. And so one of the things that we're always having to sort of identify additional funders, make that argument that here's the thing you really care about. Here's why journalism is going to help make other people aware of the thing you care about, and also help you know how it's going, whether it's working, what's working elsewhere. So so it's, you know, we have grown our staff, and in early days, we're very reluctant to hire reporters. We relied on a lot of freelance because we were worried the money would go away and we would have to lay people off. And that's still a constant worry. This last year, one of the reasons we only had one person that we had to lay off when you had this huge constriction in the economy, is because we stopped assigning any freelance money. So we sort of we got rid of anything that was sort of superfluous beyond keeping our staff. So it is really, really difficult. And I think, and then I'll stop. But one of the things that I think is important for local journalists, as a national outlet that's an issue-based, you know, cover education, you know, we've really relied on big funders. I think that's been, and smaller funders, and have looked for sort of sometimes regional based funders. So someone who cares about the West or the Northeast. But for local funders, local nonprofit news outlets, the ones that have done very well here in the US have really focused on membership. So very much the public radio model, where you have some big funders underwriting things and sponsors, and then really relying on members and small donors. So you'll see that in places like Vermont Digger, in Hawaii. They have a really fantastic, Civil Beat is a really fantastic and successful local news outlet, Mississippi Today. So some of these outlets have done a really good job around membership, and that's more difficult at the national level. But I do think membership campaigns and being super smart about newsletters and bringing in members that way. And for us, I mean, we're at the point where membership is small for us, but we still bring in from memberships and small donors almost $60,000 a year or so, with matches. So it's not nothing, but and for a smaller outlet, that's a big deal. So
great. I'm happy you talk about Common Core, because we have our Common Core too, and some similar situation. But that brings me another question about independence, editorial independence. Because how I want you to talk a little bit about, because okay, for example, we have to write about Common Core, but people who are funding this issue, they have some vision about Common Core, and how do you do to be independent and to criticize and to show the problems? You know, how can you is it possible to be independent? And you know, in your work, how do you do that? How you negotiate, and how can you keep this independence?
Right, that's such a great question, and it is a constant. It's a constant effort, right? It's not something you sort of like, well, we did it and we're done. We have to think about it all the time. But one of the most important things is being very clear with funders going in that you may not like our stories. We're not going to be writing about this from an advocacy standpoint. We may just, you know, our stories may uncover, you know, issues or problems about what you're funding or what you care about that you don't like. and we will run them anyway. So it's sort of being very crystal clear from the beginning that we are going to be doing journalism, independent journalism. That means you can't see it before it runs. That means we, only in rare cases, we're not going to be writing about necessarily a program that you fund. Sometimes, I sort of have a mantra, and it's very tricky. It's like we won't cover something because our funder funds it. We also won't not cover something because our funder funds it, right? So there's this tricky line where just because a funder funds something doesn't mean we walk away if it's a worthwhile story. And that's one of the reasons we try to keep the reporters, especially, and some of the editors, sort of separate from who our funders are, beyond knowing like, this is what we have, this grant, we're going to be covering this area for a while, and here's who these people are, and they're free to look it up. But we never sort of like, our conversation about like what our stories are going to be is never linked to that funder beyond the topic area. And so another piece of trying to maintain that independence is being careful about who you take money from, and especially in our space of education, where there's no funder out there who's writing checks for education that doesn't have like a strong stance on the issues they're covering. Whether here in the US, it's school choice, charter schools, it's a huge political debate, or higher ed. Higher ed's a little bit easier, but still, it's a very politicized field. And so it's very important for us not to take, for example, a grant, and we've said no to grants. So, not to take something that's about, I'm just picking something random, but, education technology in California, or something just very specific. And we've had a few grants that were even regional in focus, but the topics were so narrow that it was difficult to come up with good stories that weren't about whatever the funder is funding. So I think it's important to think about going in, is the topic that we are getting the money for broad enough that we can cover the stories that we want to cover anyway? So I think it's also on us to say no when the money is, people have dangled money from us, and it's very difficult to say no to money, right? In this environment. But we have said no to funders where it was early childhood in Chicago. That's a great topic for a Chicago outlet to take on. It's not good for us because we can't sustain the kind of national stories about that. So we've really come to be much more careful about what money we take so that we can maintain that independence, if that makes sense. And then disclosures. I mean, we always disclose when, we are writing about something that is funded by one of our funders. When we are writing about, someone who's gotten money, even if it's in the past, we always make the reader aware of that. We don't take any, opinion pieces from foundations that give us money. So it happens all the time where funders will be like, oh, our CEO wants to write an opinion piece. And we just have to say, no, like we can't. It just, it might be a good piece, but it doesn't look good. And that's not why we're here, is to publish sort of the opinions of the person who's funding us. So we sort of draw lines like that. And then there's a lot of conversations in the newsroom. It has come up less and less often as the longer we've been around. And I think, just that, now we feel like that sense of like, we have to say no if the funding is too narrow, I think has really helped us be clear-eyed about like, this is what we do. Anything else beyond that is going to take us a direction that's dangerous, frankly dangerous. And that's the language we use with our funders as well, is if you attempt to influence our reporting, or if we are seen to be sort of tainted by bias or by your agenda, then we will cease to exist. I mean, people are watching us and care. and it's endangering our existence if we are seen to be not independent on a topic. And I think there are some, we do, fair coverage of school choice based on the facts, often skeptical. We run voices that are, we've done some profiles of charter schools, for example, that show both like, accomplishments, but also the warts. And I think there's funders who have not given us money as a result because our funding, because our coverage is not, glowing or is not, it has skepticism. And I think there's money we've said no to, and I think there's money we haven't gotten because of our independent stance. And, it is what it is. But I think, and it's difficult. I mean, it's difficult when there's money out there to not take it. But yeah. I think it's really important to sort of to hold strong and say no sometimes.
Yeah, great. Either for your founders, your sponsors, and also to your mission, you probably needs to measure your impact. How do you do that? What kind of metrics do you use?
This is my favorite question and topic, so I'll try to be short, Tatiana. So we, like a lot of nonprofit media, right? The word impact became a big deal early stages. I remember going to a meeting with a bunch of news outlets that were funded by the Gates Foundation. They sort of had this media convening, and all of these mostly nonprofit outlets would get together, and a lot of the sort of traditional journalists were really upset by impact. What do you mean? And it's sort of difficult. And it's really interesting how, at least for us, we have really evolved since then around like, what are we measuring and why? And so for a while, and I think a lot of nonprofit outlets still do this, you sort of pay attention to page views and all the things that we care about, social media shares, all of that, to see like how many people are reading what we're doing, how many people are engaging in it. And then we also created an impact tracker, which the Center for Investigative Reporting back in the day helped us create, where we log impact, which can be anything from like another media outlet runs our story to, the legislature passed a law, sort of any sort of in between change. A teacher uses our story in a classroom. Our story is taken to a meeting and discussed. So all of those sort of different levels of impact, we log them. But often stories don't have any impact at all, or you don't log, or you don't hear about it. And so I think impact for journalists is very tricky. It can be easier, I think, and maybe that's because I sit from a national spot, but if you're local and you're covering a story, for the long term with multiple stories over time, you're more likely to hear and follow up and catch impact as it's happening, and see change because you're there locally covering a story. When we do a big national story, we don't always see that happening, and so it can be tricky.
How do you monitor, like you said, a teacher uses the stories?
It usually is like,
how they know
email
that?
you. Exactly, right? It's very, very anecdotal, basically. We call it anecdotal impact because it's anecdotal. It is, there's no data behind it. It's just like stories. And the way we talk about it is the stories that we can tell about our stories, right? Like, so what happens next? Yeah. But I will say, so we were doing that for a long time. And then a couple of years ago, it just felt like we were capturing these things, but there was no sort of rhyme or reason. And so we did sort of an assessment of what are and this is something that I think, and I had read, also back up, I'd also read a lot about how for-profits were measuring, so much data around engagement and page views and that kind of thing. And then nonprofit media just had sort of impact. But to me, I felt like as a nonprofit, we are mission-based, right? We are here to serve the public interest. And it felt very important to lay out, like, what are our goals here? Like, why do we exist? And so we ended up coming up with 8 what we call key performance indicators, which are basically the things that we care about, like why we exist and like how we what we're trying to do here. And one of them was just a very basic raise awareness about undercovered issues in education for the public, very basic. But others were, engage with people who care about education. And we have a sort of diversity and equity and inclusion, where it's important for us to be both reporting on and elevating the voices and representing people of color, low-income people, people in rural areas in our coverage, in our newsroom, on our opinion pages. So we made this list of 8. One of them was like, keep the lights on, like raise money, stay sustainable. So we made this list of 8 things that are like what we need, why we're here, what we're trying to do here. And then we figured out what are the things that help us measure whether we're reaching those goals. And it just feels like a lot more, it gives us sort of much more workable frame to think about like what we're doing here, rather than like, well, this story got 20,000 page views on our website and this one got 2,000. And what does that mean? It rather helped us sort of like come up with ways to think about like, well, what we're trying to do with this story is reach a broad audience. And so we gave it to the New York Times and we only got 2,000 page views, but they got 200,000 page views. And that's important to that. That's important there. And, we had a story that ran with USA Today this week where the goal was to sort of shine light on how people really living on the edge are dealing with the fact that our Congress has not passed a stimulus package to help people since the spring. And we got this huge outpouring from readers sending money to this family that we had profiled. But we will fit all of those into this list of like, well, where is that fit in like the reason why we're here, right? And thinking about, and so we have an impact section. So anyway, I could go on, but it's been really important for us not to just collect page views and impact for the sake of doing it, but to think about like, why does that matter? Where does that fit in what we're doing?
Only one more thing. You make this after the story is already published, or you think about all those things before?
I mean, in a ideal world, we would think about all of this before, but in the real world,
that's why I asked.
I mean, this is the real world. So I think we do sometimes think about, for example, with the story that ran with USA
because,
Today.
For example, I want to reach a lot of people, so I will do this with this. You think
right,
about
exactly. So with this story about the family, like for me and for the reporter, this is about, this is really a story about people waiting for Congress and our president to do something. And all of these kids are going hungry or like missing out on school while we wait on that because they don't have, money. Their parents don't have money to pay for internet and so on. So for that story needed a big national partner, right? Like we wanted like USA Today, like it was really important. Everyone will see it. They will be talking about it. That story needed that outlet. There are other times we did a story about a charter school in the Central Valley of California that was doing a lot of great work in terms of achievement for students, but also was just, it had some issues around paternalism, and it was run by a billionaire agriculture company that employed a lot of the people, like the grown-ups in the area at very low wages, but then had this really nice charter school where they could go into agriculture. So it was a really interesting story. And for us, the audience that was important were the people there, like that area in California. So instead of, I think we published it, I can't remember the news partner, which shows you how important the news partner was. But we translated it into Spanish. And I think we actually ran it with Telemundo in Spanish here. And then we created an ad on Facebook that targeted the people in that area. And it got a ton of response of people reading it in Spanish from the neighborhoods, from those towns that the charter school served, reading it in Spanish, responding on Facebook. And for that story, it was important for us, for the people that school served, to read the story. So we're doing that a lot more, where we're thinking about how can we reach a local audience here when that's what matters? If we have a story, about Mississippi's oversight of the childcare system and the problems there, the best possible outcome for that story is that the governor and the legislature read it and pay attention. Well, so the Clarion Ledger is the biggest newspaper in Mississippi. So that's the place where we're going to place that story, not the New York Times, because they don't care about the New York Times. They care about the Clarion Ledger. So we do think a lot about, and we don't always get like the partner we would want for a story, but we do think a lot about like who is the right partner for this story, for the kind of thing, not necessarily the impact we expect, because we can't control that. We don't, as journalists, I don't know, like, we don't know what the outcome should be, right? We don't have sort of an agenda around what happens next. Our job is to sort of raise the issues, show the problem, potentially show what solutions other people have tried, and then hand it off to the people who make decisions in the public. And so we can't control that, but we can control who sees it and who are the important people who need to read this story so that they can make an informed decision about what to do next.
Nice. You talked about also the newsroom, your team, a little bit. And so I wanted to talk about this. I read in your website, and it seems that you have a very qualified and experienced team. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit how you hire people, what kind of characteristics are you looking for when you choose someone for your team, and also if you have if you think about diversity in your team, and how do you do that?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and it's an ongoing effort. I mean, and obviously this summer in the US with the protests around racism, it's been a conversation in newsrooms that it's intensified in the last few months. We have always, because our mission is covering inequality in education, we've been talking about and covering race in the school system, but also thinking about it internally for a long time. And if you've looked at our staff, you can see we're not great. We have a lot of work to do. So a couple of things. So we have on our editing staff, we have, for example, our managing editor worked for the New York Times for 30 years. And one of her jobs, actually, she was the editor of Fred Hechinger, the education reporter who is our namesake of Hechinger. So she's sort of eminently qualified for the job. And she came to us after she'd taken a buyout from the New York Times, and has been our liaison with the New York Times, and is just a fantastic, very experienced person. And we have several people like that. Barbara Kantrowitz, who I think some of you may know because she came to Brazil for the Spencer Fellowship doing recruitment. And she's one of our contributing editors and has, probably the same number of years at Newsweek editing and writing. So we have some really deeply experienced, qualified people editing, but we've also been really working, for many years on pipeline issues, as we call it. So how do we develop and sort of discover and develop and work with journalists from underrepresented communities in our field, whether that's racial and ethnic or first generation college goers, for example. And so that has been always our newsroom. Like I said, so I was a staff reporter, and I'm now the executive editor. And Sarah Butramovich, who was an intern when I started, is now the data investigations editor. So we've we do a lot of promoting and developing within.
People probably like working at the Hechinger
Yes.
Report because everyone is so long time there.
Yes,
Yeah.
we have lost, the last couple of years are the first times we have lost reporters have been recruited. And I don't know if I can say it publicly yet, but we just had a reporter who left last week, but she was hired by a very prominent news outlet. And so we're both devastated and so sad to lose her, but also she's gone to a big national news outlet. And we had one of our reporters who started as an intern, and we hired and developed. And by the time he left, he was doing big narrative pieces, data, investigative work, and was hired onto BuzzFeed's investigative team. So it's a priority of ours to find people who are maybe early in their careers, but show a lot of potential. And then we do a lot of work around professionally developing folks, whether they want to become an editor, whether they want to do data, whether they want to, work on their craft as writers and reporters. So we put a lot of time into that. And recently, we had another, entry-level reporter come in who doing our social media work, but recently promoted her to become a writer and are working really hard. I mean, I think the goal for us is to take our staff, figure out where they want to go, and then work with them to get there. So that's been a big priority. And as an outlet that covers education, obviously, we try to sort of like espouse that in what we do internally too.
Okay, great. You talk a lot about this relationship you have with another newspapers and magazines. Can you tell us a little bit how did you build this relationship, and if your stories, this issue, inequality, is an issue that they are eager to have in their newspapers? If the audience from these newspapers and magazines, they accept these stories as well?
That's a good question. Just in terms of how we built the partnerships in the early days, the staff and the editors that we had were, all from other newsrooms, right? So of course we had all of these relationships, and it's been very relationship oriented, right? So I know this person at this outlet because we used to work together at other outlets. So that's how it really started, was those, we were journalists coming out of the for-profit world and creating our own thing. And talking back to our colleagues. For example, Lori, our managing editor is a good example. She's really helped us create a much tighter relationship with the New York Times than we had a relationship with the Times before, but obviously when she came on board, she knows everybody there. It sort of helped us click that in place. But we've also done a lot of cold calling. I mean, our relationship with Telemundo is because I tracked down Telemundo and I went to a conference in Miami, but really I was just going to meet with them in person and get to know them and that kind of. So we've done a lot of, figuring out who are the outlets that we'd really like to work with, and just, writing to the top people on the masthead and saying, this is what we do. It's certainly helped that we had those early relationships and can say, we've published with the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR, and then, Telemundo or the Courier Journal in Kentucky are much more open to working with us if we have that. Like any resume, like we have this on our resume, would you like to work with us? So I think it's always relationship driven. So many times we've had, this happens constantly, where editors are laid off and they're gone and we have to find someone new. But we've, for the most part, found a huge appetite for the issues we've covered. I can't think, occasionally, usually when a story that we want to publish somewhere, they say no, it's because of style, or, they don't have the bandwidth to even publishing a story that's free that we did for them doesn't mean that outlets have the sort of bandwidth to take something on. But I think for here and now, especially, We've been doing stories about inequality for years and years, obviously, and this summer there's been a huge appetite for that kind of work. In addition to, we've been covering the future of learning and innovation and education technology for years. And now, everybody's using education technology because half the country is learning from home on a laptop. And so we were really well placed to know that field really well and to be able to do stories. And so we've had both of those issues have been so important this year, that we've had a lot of outlets that have been very eager to work with us.
Great. You talk about this year, and this year is very hard for education systems all over the world. How was it for you, for Hechinger Report? Did this pandemic impact in any way your work and your funding? I don't know. How did it impact the Hechinger Report?
I mean, so certainly our funding, we had a couple funders that didn't come back, although I think that we're doing fine now. But in terms of our work, in the very early days, sort of in the spring, I think we assigned and published more stories than we have ever done. It was just a huge glut of stories responding to the outbreak. And for us, it was important. We realized, one, this was going to be a very big story, but also everyone is covering education. So that's been a real challenge, is that it's a big national story that, there are stories every single day and every single media outlet about education, which was not the case before. So one of the things that we've had to do is really think about, again, how do we stand apart? What can we do that other outlets can't manage? So one of the things we've done to great effect, I think, is profiling. We've sort of stepped back from the incremental, what's going to happen tomorrow? Are the schools going to open? How are we going to test students for COVID? Some of those very questions for now, and thought about, one, the impact on families. And we've done a series of profiles that we called critical condition, where we looked at populations of students that were particularly at risk. So students with disabilities, homeless students, rural students, Native students, and then told, the story about why those populations were particularly vulnerable and how they were being hard hit through the story of one family and one kid. And those have been very effective, because, they're the kind of stories that journalists always want to be able to tell. They're very narrative focused, but, like this family that we wrote about this weekend, who was already on the edge of poverty, and how they've been able to survive barely these last few months. You get readers so engaged in people's lives and a character that they care about, that you draw them into these really important issues. So doing that reporting that way has been very effective. At the same time, Hechinger, we always send people to report in person. We've sent people, not yet to Brazil, although it's a goal, but we've been all over the world. I know, but we've been all over the world. I've been to a tiny island in Alaska to report. I've been to India. Our reporters have been in every state, I think, in the country, because reporting in person, seeing the scenes and the people and getting that sort of color for our stories is really, really important. Our stories are very character based, and we can't do that now. So we've really had to be very creative about how do our reporters do these in-depth profiles when they can't be there. And it's been really challenging, but I think we figured out a lot of ways, FaceTime, texting with people, Zoom calls, to still do those kinds of stories without being able to travel.
You probably working from home. Your
this is my house.
Yeah.
Or a tiny apartment, I should say.
Yeah, because I was thinking, after this experience, maybe some newsrooms, they are not coming back.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a problem, or that's a solution for small newsrooms now, small media outlets?
I mean, I think I know of some like small nonprofit news outlets that didn't ever have a newsroom.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a few that have started that way in someone's living room. So I think, going back to that, we are sort of specific to, we are at a university, so we sort of have a space.
Oh,
But
yeah.
we were very ready to go remote and work from home because now over half of our staff lives in other states. So we sort of
Mm,
were set up to do this anyway. And our editor in chief, Liz Willen, has this philosophy that like if you're at your desk every day, you are not doing your job. As a journalist, like you should not be here to
yeah.
go out of the newsroom. So, and that's the kind of reporting we do, is like out of you shouldn't be in the newsroom all the time anyway. So I do think this encourages us to be out there, even if some of us are in our homes. But a lot, some of our reporters are, at least driving. They can drive places. We aren't sending anyone on an airplane. It's also encouraged us to, and I think this is great for our diversity efforts, to find reporters who are in a place that we can't get to. So, we found a great, fantastic writer in Kansas City, for example, who's from Kansas City, did a beautiful story for us this summer about families facing eviction. And I would have sent a staff writer to Kansas City to do that story. And I'm so glad that I didn't, and I was able to use someone local to tell that story.
Great. Well, I think we are getting to the end of this conversation, but I wanted to ask you one last thing. Well, inequality is a massive problem here in Brazil too, in education, and now it's going to be even more significant, this problem. So since this is your main issue, I wanted to hear from you. In which way journalists can contribute to face this problem?
Yeah.
An independent journalist
Yeah.
can contribute to face this inequality problem.
Right. Well, I mean, for us, the most important and effective stories and making, a difference in terms of like the public reacting and policymakers reacting is to do sort of three things. Stories that really show the face of inequality so that you are seeing the kids and the families and how they're affected by these circumstances, and telling stories that are very character driven, deep stories from from the kitchen tables of the families who are affected, combined with data, really compelling data, or public records that really show sort of the policy. When we do accountability journalism, we're really thinking about like, what are the agencies that are not responding to this issue, or that are, not doing it competently, or whatever the case is, and really focusing on the facts, the data that show that. So those two things I think are really important. And then solutions. I do think we have found that you can show the problems and it leaves people feeling very hopeless. And to make a difference, I think it's really important for people to show that it doesn't have to be that way, that there are other places or people or schools that have figured something out that is at least making a dent in that problem. And for us, that can mean the next district over. We did a story about desegregation or resegregation in Mississippi this year, but we also went to a district in Mississippi where they have continued to keep their schools racially integrated since they were forced to do it in the 80s. And what a big difference that's made for kids. We have gone to other countries. We've gone to Australia and Singapore and Estonia to report stories about what those countries are doing that seems to be working and what we can learn from them. Other states. So I think those solution stories are a really important piece of how do we cover this enormous problem in both in the US and in the Brazilian education system. And if you're doing all those three things, I think you can really, make an impact.
Thank you. It was so
Thank
nice to
you.
talk to you. and very inspiring. I think not only me, but a lot of people here, a lot of journalists will be inspired about your stories. I hope you enjoyed too our conversation.
Thank you. Hopefully next time I can come in person. So.
Yes. Hope so. And you can tell some stories here from Brazil too.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Estamos encerrando essa conversa maravilhosa com a Sara sobre jornalismo independente, jornalismo de educação independente. Agradeço a todos que nos acompanharam e convido para continuar acompanhando as próximas mesas do 4º Congresso Internacional de Jornalismo de Educação junto com a gente. Obrigada e até mais.